Okay, off you go.
Yeah, welcome back, Els.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be back.
I'm so excited about this. I have so many questions. I hope we keep doing this like for a really good long time.
Yeah, that's nice.
Um, but today I want you to talk about the senses, and we all are kind of familiar with the five senses, and then there are the three mystery senses. And
Shoot.
yes, so what the senses are, and maybe um, why do we bother understanding them in relation to our dogs? Why is that a good idea?
Right. Well, let's start with that last question. Why do we bother with them? Because, yeah, that's the most important question, maybe, and it can lead us into the next. Um, so what's interesting about the senses is that, see, I always like to bring things down to the most simple and smallest units. Like when we look at behavior, where does it come from? How does behavior start? How do thoughts, how do emotions start? The first triggers are the sensory triggers. You need to see something to be moved by it. You need to hear a poem to be moved by it, right? You need to hear um, the sound of your lover to get a certain emotion going in you. These are just very simple sensory aspects. And on top of that can come some emotions. On top of that can come some behaviors. There can be some physiological reactions, responses in the body. There can be behavioral responses. But if we want to bring things down to the bare necessities or the simplest uh, components, then we come back to the triggers which are sensory. You cannot perceive anything if it doesn't start with a sensory trigger, right?
So
Even when it's not.
does that mean that these sensory inputs or triggers are actually all the antecedents that we speak about in behavior?
I think these are the conditio sine qua non. There is, if you don't have that, you won't have anything. There have been some really cruel tests on babies in well, very long time ago, where they wanted to see how babies or humans would develop without any input or without any triggers from the outside world. I believe they were put in a cave somewhere. Well, cruel, extremely cruel. They were fed with as little contact as possible, and they had all the what we would think of basic necessities to survive, but they all died. So the most basic things to even develop are very simple sensory triggers like touch. So important. I bet many people know that's the tests that were done with rhesus monkeys, where they had two types of replacement moms. There was the one that was made out of iron wire, and the one that was made out of fabric. And the one that was made out of wire, they would uh, have the little monkeys feed from that one through a bottle. But the other one was always present as well, which was just like a doll they could cuddle, right? In the shape of a monkey, but it was in fabric. The other one was in shape of a monkey, but it was with wire. So they wanted to see which one these baby monkeys would cling to. And they could only go for food with the iron, hard metal. But still, in times of distress or when we needed a cuddle, they would go for the softer and warmer one, right? Very harsh experiments, but this is telling us a bit about how important these sensory triggers are. This is about the temperature. This is about how soft or how hard it feels. So it's the tactile component. The tactile component is quite important, and especially for us humans. We are very tactile. We like to touch and to feel. So that is one aspect. So, but coming back to your second question, why do we want to pay attention to sensory processing in our dogs? Understanding behavior becomes so much easier, so much clearer when we can draw this very simple picture of what is the exact trigger that the dog is responding to. This is how I observe all dogs. When I observe dogs, I try to constantly see everything they do, every move they make, when they don't make a move, with how they turn, and what has happened prior to that. Like there's a sound in the distance, and after that sound in the distance, they turn their head the other side and walk that 2 steps in that direction. There is a visual cue in that direction. They see something move, they lift their head, they turn their head in that direction. That's how I'm constantly observing dogs. I literally see all those details, and I'm aware of everything that happens in the environment. Those are all sensory cues. How do they respond to it? And how often do they respond? And how strong is their response to all those sensory cues? And what are the sensory cues that they respond strongest to? Is it mostly to the visuals? And when they have a visual cue somewhere, or when they have a visual, it doesn't need to be a cue per se, but something that visually triggers them, what does it trigger them to do? And how strong is their response to it? That can tell me so much about, well, their sensitivities to specific sensory channels, as I like to call them. I like to call the sensory systems, I like to call them channels of communication. The tactile system is a channel of communication. When I touch a dog, this is a communication. He feels that I'm communicating with me. If this touch reaches a dog in a conscious way, that he consciously perceives it, then we could say that this is a means of communication. Even if it's unconscious, it's gonna have an influence. So this is about the tactile channel. There is the auditory channel. There is the visual channel. Those are most common channels by which we can communicate to the dogs, right? And of course, for them, the olfactory channel is very important. But so when I'm observing, I look at how strong are their responses to specific stimuli, to those specific different channels of communication. And are their responses too strong? Or do they seem hard or quite nervous in certain aspects of certain channels? Do these channels sound, and I'm not speaking about auditory, but when I say when a channel sounds too loud, this is just a way of expressing myself, I could be talking about the visual, that might come in too strong, and it sort of forces the dog to work with that visual aspect. Or the auditory channel is coming through too loud, meaning it's not filtered. And it comes in too strong, so that it forces the dog to either respond with a stress reaction, or that the dog really has to respond to it without the dog having a very honest choice in it. Because if the filter doesn't work strongly or good enough or well balanced enough, depending on the situation, depending on the state of the dog, if the filter doesn't work, then information just comes in too strong, it bombards the brain, and the dog has to do something with it. So they don't always have a choice in the matter. And that's what I want to see, especially from a behavioral perspective. I want to see, what are the sensory triggers? I need to observe them too in the environment that the dog is in. I need to observe also those triggers, so that I can judge whether the responses of the dog are actually in balance to the actual reality of the situation, or if the responses are too strong in terms of too high arousal, maybe fearful, maybe too strong in trying to escape from them or react to them, maybe in an aggressive way. Okay. If we see that, if we can see and understand that all the reactions that come from the dog are actually triggered by some type of sensory triggers, and we need to know by which channel or which type of sensory trigger, and then understand whether the response is actually in balance with the strength of the actual trigger. And it tells us so much about behavior. It makes observing behavior and watching and evaluating behavior so much easier when you bring it down to the bare essential simple parts. What are the sensory triggers?
That's fascinating. You were saying that it becomes easier. To me, it's so it's not more complicated to perceive in that way.
No,
I guess you have to understand what you're looking for.
Yeah, you need to see, when I teach this to colleagues, behaviorists, what I see mostly is that as they are observing a dog, they are looking for a diagnosis. They are looking for a reason for the behavior, the unwanted behavior, or the behavior that the client wants to change, right? I'm not looking for that. When I'm observing a dog, I just want to know how he functions, how he gets to certain behaviors, and his behavior is going to tell me that. His behavior and me being in the same environment as the dog is, so that I also have those same triggers. I have those same, I can perceive, observe, hear the same sensory triggers. And then I can assess how the dog is functioning, how the dog is perceiving the world around him, and what effect it has on him, how he needs to respond to it. Because, so I've spoken about that filter, the filter of all sensory stimuli. That filter happens before the emotional load comes on top of it, before the emotional value. So first, when information comes to you, your receptors receive it, visual receptors, olfactory receptors, auditory receptors, they receive it. Then they go through a a filtering system, and not all those stimuli are actually pushed through that filter and go to your cortex for actual conscious perception. But then again, it depends on how that filter works. That filter is not one stable thing that for the rest of your life remains the same. It's very fluctuating.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah.
Can you have any power over these filters?
Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do in sensory integration therapy.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do. And that's where I know you want to discuss that in the next talk we'll have. But that's also very much where the polyvagal theory comes into play. Because then we're going to speak about modulation. Depending on how your autonomic nervous system is functioning, it will have an influence on your filters. If you're functioning in fight flight, of course you're going to be prone to perceive things that are important for your survival, or that are important for how safe or unsafe you're feeling. If you're functioning in your social engagement system, all your senses are going to be tuned towards social interactions. And this is where it has a huge influence on how that filter will be working for you. Okay, so then it becomes quite important to know how to influence that filter, how to work with this dog so that whatever stimuli come to him, he does not perceive it in the sense of, oh, this could be dangerous and maybe I need to be on guard, maybe I need to respond really quickly. But he might be able to perceive more the social engagement cues, which might be present in that same actual situation. Right? So this is why we need to perceive the senses, and be aware of the sensory stimuli that are hitting the dog, that are being perceived by the dog, or not even perceived because that's a conscious aspect, but that are being received by the dog's receptors, and then see how those stimuli are filtered or not. And that's the process.
So you meant,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's exactly, you mentioned touch, so tactile stimulus, and you mentioned auditory. Can you say a little more about auditory? I have a very sensitive dog at home. That's why I'm very interested.
Yeah. When I have new dogs to work with, as long as I don't have a very clear trust relationship, and even then, I don't use my voice very often with dogs. I'm going to work much more with my body language, much more. I'm going to be present in a specific way. I'm going to move. I'm going to put a certain presence in the environment, and that's how I work mostly with dogs. That's because their language is mostly body language, right? But when you ask about auditory, I might use my voice, because that's going to be auditory stimuli for the dog. I might use it in a way to just make some noise, to make some white noise sometimes. Because especially for dogs that don't have a lot of confidence, for fearful dogs, when you have a situation where you do not speak at all, And the dog is actually a bit fearful. When you drop a silence, when in a conversation, you suddenly drop a silence, you know how that can actually put you on edge, that you really tweak your ears, and you could, if there would be a pin dropping, you'd hear it because of that sudden silence. So we need to be aware of that. When I'm observing dogs and I'm speaking with the client, I might, without having anything to say, really, I might continue speaking, especially when I see that the dog is about to dare to do something, go and investigate the environment, dare to move a bit further from the owner. If I drop a silence at that point where the dog actually thinks like, oh, okay, sounds like they're busy with whatever they do, and maybe I can just wander off and do my thing. I absolutely want that to happen. So I might continue with some white noise, which is just some chatter that doesn't mean much, just to carry the situation. So I am often using my voice to carry a situation. Again, because of the effect that it can have on the dog's autonomic nervous system. If the dog can hear my voice being very relaxed, and even if you listen to a person speaking in a foreign language which you don't understand, you get the sense of whether that person is nervous or whether that person is relaxed. And now in some languages that is a bit different, because some languages are always spoken very fast. Yeah, that's true. But still, you get an idea of whether the person is really nervous and anxious, or maybe angry, even if you don't understand anything about the language, right? So for dogs, that's the same. And that's quite peculiar because they don't have a language like we do, a spoken language like we do. We have such a rich spoken language. They don't, but the effect of our voice and how we speak is still the same. It can either calm them down or it can arouse them, which we all know. Because when we play with them, we go like, oh, it's just so good. Right? This is often something we need to explain to our clients, like, now you want him to calm down. So you don't go like, good boy, when he settles down, because you want him to be relaxed. Oh, that's a good boy. Well done. All right. So white noise, or carrying a situation, or influencing the dog towards calmness or towards more arousal. This is something that can be achieved over the auditory channel.
What are your thoughts about very vocal dogs? Are they self-stimulating in a way? Like I'm thinking about the excessive barkers. Is that auditory or is that?
So I don't think they are stimulating their own auditory channel. Obviously, that will happen, but I don't think that's the reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are. So just to break down what barking is from a sensory perspective, when the dog is doing it, right?
Yeah.
So barking is done by constricting muscles, contracting muscles, right? So that would mean it's a proprioceptive type.
That's what I thought.
Sensory stimuli. Yes.
Yeah.
There will also be the vibration, which you might say could be proprioceptive and tactile, both. Usually there's quite some movement and some, when there's an excited bark, it's not just the bark by itself. there's also going to be more tension in the rest of the body, more movement as well. So again, proprioceptive. And when more movement, there will also be the vestibular component.
Mm-hmm.
But the barking is usually from a dog that is quite aroused. Aroused because of too much stress, positive or negative, right? So then I'm going to look at, okay, why such arousal? Where does it come from? What is the trigger? Is it a chronic issue? Is it very acute because something happened right at this moment? Or is this a barker that is like a chronic barker? And then how do you bring more balance, that there is less constant stress? And how do you bring this dog to a more calm state? Again, that's then looking at how can we influence the autonomic nervous system to function in a different state.
Yeah, that's a great one. So I have a dog that barks a lot, and somebody once, a pet sitter said to me, he loves to hear himself, and I was like, what? My thought always has been that he loves to hear himself, but I was thinking he's self calming because he's in control of that stimulus, and outside is making him anxious.
When I see that in dogs that they like to hear themselves, it's usually quite confident dogs.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my observation. When it's dogs that just love to sit in the garden and bark away and hear themselves and then listen to another dog bark back in the distance, that's going to be quite confident dogs. If it's a dog that is actually barking because of some worry, a worry because of a certain stimulus of a sounds or movements or whatever, that means that there is higher arousal. Something causes higher arousal, causes a bit of worry, causes a bit of anxiety. And usually the barking then does not help the dog to calm down. When you have these barkers that just like to sit somewhere and bark and then listen, is anyone enjoying my bark out there? Do I need to bark a bit louder? Can you all hear me? This is me. I'm telling you my story of the day. Those are quite confident dogs, and what you will see is that their barking will not arouse them. They will not get hyped up because of it. They will actually be quite pleased with themselves and go for a snooze afterwards.
Okay, that just means humans have to get used to that.
Yeah, or have a conversation with your dog. Lisa, my prior dog, she loved to in the evening sit outside and just she would sit down in the garden and she would go woof 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 woof, and then she'd listen. Oh yeah, there's one responding in the distance, and then he would bark a little and then she would bark a little. Yeah. And if I thought, okay, it's a bit late and the young children next door, I'm sure they're in bed now, I would just step outside and go like, well, you're doing a great job talking to the neighborhood. But maybe we can continue tomorrow at a different time of the day. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that's part of their social life, right?
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it can be. Yeah.
I can I'm with that. Not sure about my neighbors, but we'll have a talk. Let's talk about visual perception for dogs.
See, what's
Why
interesting
is that
about
important?
how dogs see is that they see at 80 frames per second, where we see at 60 frames per second. So
Ooh,
that means they get a lot more information through their visual
wow.
than we do. Um, and that's also why it's so important that how you move and how you, if you try and have a dog follow you in the sensory integration exercises and you only do this, when the dog is really into his communication, he's already turning because you just did that, right? And very often I have to help people be aware of how much they actually move when they think they're standing perfectly still. Because for the dog, for us, it with 60 frames per second, that might be only half a frame, right? But for the dog, it is, say it's 1.5 frame. But that means in sensory triggering of the triggers of the receptors and the receptors giving information to the brain, it's much more. So the brain is able to do much more or draw much more information from it than what we are able to do. This is why we will never read dogs the way dogs read dogs, because they see more.
That's
They get more
amazing.
information. Although they might see in less colors,
Yeah.
and they might have different depth perception, but still they perceive in 80 frames per second. So it means that per time unit of a second, they actually have more information than we do in terms of how many frames are being processed.
So that's probably also the responsiveness to us that we are not aware of because they're
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And then it's such a shame if we are only working through cues, verbal cues, to communicate with a dog. And this is why I find it so easy and so extremely rich to communicate with dogs through body language. And not just that is not visual cues. I mean, I have lots of visual cues about the tricks. They go with visual cues, but I'm not speaking about visual cues. I'm speaking about talking to the dog. It is not done with words. It's done through body language. And it's extremely important if we want to put them in their social engagement system.
Everything we are expressing with our bodies is a social cue to them, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, yes, yes. But it might also, of course, be a cue of danger.
Right. Communication, I was thinking, yeah, not just the friendly social, but just
Yeah,
our emotions come through our body.
yeah. And it's so enriching when you start talking through your body instead of through your words, especially with dogs, because they immediately respond with their body as well. And when you start talking through body language, and of course they will respond through body language, but the depth of that communication and the connection that you feel through that, compared with the connection that you can make when you speak, the depth, it's a different world.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's why I love my job.
Next level. Mm. When I say about they can read us through visual cues, or they know what's going on in our heads when they see our faces, but they probably can also smell what's going on with us.
Yes, they probably can. And I have to say probably because I can't. I don't know. So that is the sense that I use least, or actually not, in sensory integration, because I do not have a reference for what they can smell.
Mm.
I don't, my olfactory world is not as rich as theirs. I don't know, when I'm working with them, I don't know all the olfactory cues that are reaching them because I can't perceive them.
We just don't have that vocabulary.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have that reference frame.
Yeah.
So obviously it's going to be there. Smells are there. As I work with pate, they have, that's what I use for their dopamine reaction. That's what I use to get their motivation. And of course, it has a strong influence on their olfactory channel. And it has a strong influence on their gustatory channel, but mostly their olfactory channel. That's what is going to really trigger them and really motivate them to be interested to work with me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's as far as it goes for what I do with the olfactory channel.
What about gustatory, which is
Same.
the taste?
Yeah. So same. What I use is pate. I use pate because it's easy. It's an easy thing to work with. I can use very little of it on, I just have some of it on my finger and I have the dog lick it. The reason I do this, well, first of all, dogs love it from an olfactory and gustatory perspective. But the reason I use that is that, well, first of all, I can give a lot of rewards, treats, and it's not like kibble or treats that it's immediately a little chunk of food, but it can be like just a slither of food, but still high reward for them because of the taste and because of how rich in olfaction it is. But it gives me so much information because they have contact with my skin. So I will feel them. It's about the sensory information it gives me. I will feel how they take it, how fast, how good they are at just licking that finger. If I have retrievers, I need to roll up my sleeve because they're probably gonna lick my full arm, right? If I have careful Shelties, they're gonna just lick the tip of my finger, right? So it tells me a lot about the dog I have, and I can feel the dog. So when I put the dog through an exercise that might be difficult, but actually it doesn't really look difficult when the dog is doing it, but when I feel the dog, maybe after that exercise, the licking is much faster, or the licking is much longer. He continues licking for longer because maybe he is trying to calm himself down. Maybe he is too aroused to stop licking quickly. Maybe the licking is harder. Maybe there's some teeth in between the licking as well. It gives me so much more information. But okay, that's not gustatory. That is not olfactory. That is actually my tactile sense that get so much more information if I use something that is olfactory and gustatory pleasing to the dog.
How beautiful. It's a win-win.
Absolutely.
So we covered the 5 basic senses. You talked about touch, auditory, visual, olfactory, and the taste. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about that special proprioception sense. What is it? What is it there for, and how important is it? And do you work with it? And tell us.
Sure. I'm going to close the blind first because I'm being blinded.
You have some wild clouds coming through, I can tell.
There you go. Okay, now I can actually see you. So proprioception. First of all, what is proprioception? Proprioception is the sense that tells us where our body is and where parts of our body are. So in each joint, in each ligament, in each joint capsule, in each muscle, we have these receptors that are constantly telling us, oh, there is that much tension in this muscle, there is that much tension in this muscle, this much tension in the tendon, and that much tension in this tendon. And actually, what our brain does with all of that information, because this is happening constantly from all the muscles, from all the tendons, we are getting information, especially when we move, because it's changing. Others can habituate. But so the flow of information is quite constant from all these different parts of the body. It's a quite a lot of information that is constantly coming through to the brain, and that is being computed in the brain so that we exactly understand without looking how I'm holding my arm. I know without looking how I'm holding my legs underneath my desk. That's true proprioception. If I combine that with my visual perception of my environment, I know exactly how I am positioned in my environment and also where I am positioned in my environment. So this tells me, so proprioception brings me body awareness. Combining body awareness, so proprioception, with other senses brings me spatial orientation. I need to know how I'm positioned, how I can move my body in my environment around me. So when we come back to the filter, this is also something that gets filtered because, and we habituate also to these sensory stimuli. I'm not constantly getting the triggers that your knee is like this, your knee is like this, your knee is like this. I do have them, but when I'm moving, of course, as it changes, I get much more information. And this much more information for some dogs can be actually overwhelming. So for some dogs, their own movements can be too much, can be too many triggers, too much stimuli. And that's especially for dogs that don't have good body awareness. Because if you don't have good body awareness, but out of this body, of which you're not very aware of what shape it exactly has, and there's constantly this information coming, but you don't have the reference frame to say, well, yeah, of course, that's my knee, and that's my tail, and that's my hip, and that's my back. But it's just some chaos. Then you can see dogs that when they start moving, they only get more aroused. Yeah, because the lack of body awareness, when you then hit your brain with a lot of sensory stimuli from that body, it's just going to be chaos up here. Now, chaos does not usually result in calmness.
Mhm.
Chaos often brings on more chaos, often brings on more movement because of more arousal. So what we can do for those dogs is make them more aware of how their body's positioned, how their body is moving, bring them more body awareness. And body awareness, we need to understand that that comes through proprioception. So if we want them to get more body awareness, we need to get them in exercises where they will focus on how they move, on where they stand, on what they can do with their own body. If you do that by luring a treat in front of the dog and luring the dog on over obstacles and through tunnels and whatever, the focus of the dog is going to be on this, not on this. And you can get dogs that stumble over the obstacles. That doesn't bring awareness. So this is again where we need to work with body language. Body language if you want to have body awareness. You need to work with, hey buddy, we are now moving over there, but hey, guess what? There's an obstacle in your way. Think about it. How will you do that? They need to visually perceive it, process it. When this is done, praxis, think about how they need to solve it, what they want to do, where they want to get to, come up with a plan of how they're going to use this, their body, to get to it. That is building body awareness through proprioception. And of course, body awareness is more complex than just proprioception, but it is built from proprioception and it needs to be integrated with the other senses.
So not every fitness routine equals proprioception routine
Well,
necessarily.
every fitness routine equals proprioception because whenever you move your body, your proprioception is triggered, right? Those receptors will be triggered. Even when you're not moving, those those receptors are giving information to your brain about not moving, about the position your body is in. But not every fitness routine will lead to better body awareness, because that's where you need the word awareness says it. You need actual concentration of the dog on what he can do with his body and on how to do it. So he needs to try to balance on a narrow beam and take some obstacles on that beam and get to the other side. Do it calmly, do it slowly, so that it is about concentration on your own body, not about getting to the treat as fast as you can.
Yeah, that's a different process.
It is a different process, yes. And that's why I don't have anything against them, but this is why I'm still not using foam pads or wobbly pillows for dogs. I have them and I sometimes experiment again with them, but I'm still not using them regularly. Actually, for the moment, not at all. Why? Because, see, I work with dogs that have an issue with body awareness. I work with dogs that have an issue with balance. And if they already have an issue on the solid and stable floor, it doesn't make any sense from my perspective, and I'll explain about it, to put them on something that is wobbly, because I need them to focus on their own body, find out what they can do, and find the references which are stable and very clear references to work with. Now, I'm a physio, and of course, in the humane sector, I've worked a lot with wobbly pillows and foam pillows to in rehab when people have broken their ankle or whatnot. But this is from, so then I'm talking about physical re-education and making them. Of course, I'm not going to start with something that is very wobbly. When the person has broken their ankle and they need to start with rehab, we don't start with something that is wobbly, because they're not going to be stable on solid ground, right? So we go through a process, and they might end up also doing exercises on a surface that is not as firm as the floor. When I work from the sensory integration perspective, I still haven't used those foam pads. I have experimented with them. But when I consider that I really want to get a grip on how they should be processing and where they should be concentrating on, it's so much easier to work with solid equipment that gives them very clear tactile, visual, proprioceptive, and vestibular feedback, but very clear. I can make it difficult enough without using anything that is wobbly. I will, however, also use equipment that can zigzag, because I will teach them that by shifting their center of gravity, they can have an influence on that object, because that's already quite a difficult exercise. Then they need to be aware of how they influence in their own body, their own center of gravity.
Yeah, that sounds very advanced.
Yeah, but it's quite doable. It's quite doable, but it is advanced.
Maybe we can talk about proprioception in a separate episode altogether. I want you to tell me more about that other ception sense.
You talking about interoception.
Yes. Tell us what it is. What did dogs do with that?
So interoception is about, part of it is unconscious and part of it is conscious. So the conscious part is knowing that you're hungry, knowing that you're cold. What else is there about physiology? Knowing that you're sleepy. Okay, because you feel it. It's used from internally, from inside your body, that reach your brain, and you adapt your behavior to it. When you're hungry, you're going to look for food. When you're cold, you're going to look for shelter or for warmth, right? When you're sleepy, you're going to look for a place to rest. Okay, this is interoception. So interoception is all the information that comes from inside your body and that is reaching your brain, and it will have, or it can have, an influence on your behavior. When it is about being cold, there might just be, if it's not too much that you need to shiver or that you really want to put on a warm jacket, but it's just a very slight change in temperature, there's going to be just some physiological response to adjust your temperature. So that could be unconscious. When it's about blood pressure, there might be an internal response which you're not aware of, and which, you know, tries to make some changes in your blood pressure. And there's so many things that are organized automatically in your body with help of your brain or your neurological system that you're not always aware of. So interoception is something that you're not always aware of. But obviously, it will have an influence on your behavior. As I said, when you're cold, your behavior will change. You will do something about it. When you're hungry, your behavior will change. So that's interoception. Now, and again, I'm jumping to your next talk about the polyvagal theory, but when we will speak about neuroception, your interoception becomes very important. And becoming aware of your physiological responses in a certain environment, in a certain situation, that becomes very important to become more aware of neuroception, which is not an actual sense. This is just a term that is being coined by Peter Porges from the Polyvagal theory, which helps us understand some reactions in the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about that next time.
Perfect. We still have one more.
We do have one more.
Yeah. And it's the vestibular. Please enlighten us.
The vestibular system is the system that tells us about whether we are in balance. In balance, actually in reference to the Earth's gravity system. The vestibular system is located in our inner ear. And so actually the vestibular system itself only tells us about the position of the head. The vestibular system tells us whether the head is tilted, whether it's in any type of rotation. These are all types of rotation, depending on which axis you consider, and whether there is a linear movement forward, backward, up, down, any type of linear direction in the three-dimensional plane. Because it's placed in the inner ear, it's actually only just telling us about the position of the actual receptors, and so in the head of the dog or the human. But obviously, all sensory channels are integrated, and the sensory channel of the vestibular system is very closely connected to the eyes. And you know that because when you are reading a book, let's see whether I have a book. Of course I have a book. I have the sensory integration manual here.
Ooh.
Of course I have a book. When you're reading a book, we all know that we can move our head in all type of directions, and as long as it's not too far, we can keep reading on the same line, and our eyes shouldn't jump on the page. And this tells us about how closely the connection is between the vestibular system and the muscles of the eye. So there's a really important and very fast and very direct connection between the vestibular system and the visual system. The visual sensory system, but actually the visual motor system of how our eye is rotating. And this, of course, is again very important for balance, because if we move our head and our visual focus is moving along with our head, this would be quite dizzying. So again, to keep your balance, you need the vestibular system, but you also need the visual focus. So when we're working with balance for a dog, using visual focus and facilitating it for a dog that really has difficulties with balance is going to be a very important tool to get the balancing system working better in this dog, to get better proprioception, to get better coordination in the dog's body. Because balance does depend, and we all know that when we are doing a difficult balancing exercise, we're going to focus on a still point in the front of us, on a wall or whatever, something that is still, and we can focus on it and we keep our eyes fixated on it, so that becomes a reference that helps us to stabilize the rest of our body, right? So vestibular system works very closely together with the visual system. And it also works very closely together, or there's a very direct link between the muscles of the neck, because this is where the receptor is of the vestibular system. And these muscles will influence how the receptor in general is being mobilized, right? And this works in two directions. So it helps to stabilize the head. And to stabilize the head, these muscles need information from the vestibular system. They need information on what is stable. And these receptors in the inner ear will tell that, will know that, will perceive that. Actually, the cortex that perceives, but anyway. But through that information, the muscles in the neck are going to be coordinated well to keep our visual focus and to keep our head well balanced, or the dog's head well balanced on the neck. There's also a very close link with the postural muscles. So when I see a dog that has, so the tone of the postural muscles, the tone is how strong of a contraction of the muscles there is in constantly, not because you need to move. When I sit up straight, I need to have a certain tone in my muscles, otherwise it would be slouching like that. Okay, it would be hanging in my ligaments and on my bones. But when I want to sit up straight, I need a certain contraction in my muscles, right? Now, these are the postural muscles along the spine of the dog. And they need to have a certain tone constantly to have a nice top line. When the dog has this, is actually arching down because there is not enough muscle tone. There can be many reasons for that. But if the reason is just not enough muscle tone in these postural back muscles, what we need to do is vestibular exercises. We need to trigger the vestibular system so that the vestibular information is filtered differently and has more of an influence on the tone of these muscles. So when I have a dog with a saddleback, I'm going to test whether he has a good responses to vestibular stimuli. And I'm going to, if that's not the case, I'm going to work on the vestibular system and give the dog exercises where I'm going to trigger the vestibular system. I'm going to make that sensory channel more important so that the dog has to integrate it with different channels and has to work with it. And then I can have an influence on the postural tone. Yeah, maybe that's
really interesting.
A bit complicated.
It sounds very complicated, but it makes me wonder, do you find that, because we never talk about, I never heard anybody else in fitness or even human fitness, we don't talk about vestibular exercises that much unless you really are at risk for falling. But do you find that dogs actually need these exercises, or are they just like an extra? Do you know what I'm asking?
Well, of course, in my practice, I see a lot of dogs that need it. Um, difficult for me to say whether dogs would be fine with clearly not all dogs are fine without those exercises, because otherwise I wouldn't even be able to have started this research and started to dig into sensory integration. So could you rephrase your question and
So I
see?
wonder if, yeah, my question would be, okay, how about this question? Maybe it's a different question altogether. Do dogs in general in pet world, do dogs get enough vestibular proprioceptive input on daily basis to have healthy sensory systems?
Yeah, they should. Just normal puppy growth and puppy play and should all help them to develop that. When does it not happen? Well, first of all, what I'd like to get to as well, and this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but sensory integration for children is seen as a developmental problem. So something that you can't see from birth, but as they develop and as they grow, you start to see that certain sensory information is not being processed ideally in the brain. And that's a developmental issue, which means that their brain is differently wired, and you can give them exercises and tools to deal with the different wiring. Okay, but it's sort of not something that actually goes away. They have a different wiring, and you help them to deal with it. And you can help them in some cases perfectly well, so that no one ever sees that there are sensory issues, right? I see that somewhat different in dogs. When I think about sensory integration and I consider how dogs process sensory information, I see it as a developmental issue, meaning that in their development, there can be periods that certain type of information is filtered too much. And then they have a sort of they will fall back on developing that sensory channel. But with enough effort and with the right type of exercises, we can actually bring it up to speed again and bring it up to where it should be. So that's a bit of a difference. My perspective on sensory integration with dogs is somewhat different from how we see it in children. Okay. So, for instance, if a dog growing up goes through a period of too much stress, too much arousal, too much constant arousal, because of how that influences the filtering system of the sensory information, it's going to bring certain type of sensory information much more to the forefront, and it's going to dampen other sensory information, which of course, as they are developing, has an influence on their development. But it's not because the brain cannot process this type of information or has a different wiring. It's just because during their development, there was this phase, or maybe it's still going on and we need to change that too. But there is this time when their filter was working differently. And because they have made their growth or their development through that phase, they come out with, they come out a bit differently. They come out being either very reactive to some visual stimuli or not responsive enough to maybe some vestibular stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, a dog that is born with hip dysplasia or that develops with not really perfect growth of the hips and too much laxity in those joints. First of all, that dog, because of the hypermobility and instability, the dog is going to prefer working more from his front limbs, right? So he's going to be more focused on working from the front limbs. And from a sensory perspective, proprioceptive perspective, he's going to focus more, and the filtering is going to be more focused on information that comes from this part. The development of body awareness is now going to lag behind for what is concerns the front leg, the hind legs, because they're too difficult to stabilize. The information we get from that part of the body is like chaos, because it's literally going all over the place, and we can actually not control it with our muscles because we don't have good body awareness, we don't have good coordination, we can't stabilize, and they're in a vicious circle. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now this can have an effect on their brain, on their behavior. This usually makes them insecure, or that can be fearful, or it can be reactive, especially in social situations with other dogs. Or it can make them, it can make them hyper arousable. Why? Because this is chaos. All the information from here, they don't have a good reference frame. They can't do much with it because they can't control it. It arouses them so much. So when I get young dogs with hip dysplasia, quite often we get very arousable dogs. Why? They are constantly bombarded with information, a lot of information from this, the wobbliness, which actually also sets off a bit of an alarm in the brain, like, whoa, what? This wobbliness is not safe, it's not good, which again brings on more arousal. And of course, all of that is going to influence their behavior. Right? So this is all these things that I'm talking about now. This is how I can see the dog's behavior if I understand what is going on in the dog from a sensory perspective.
And most dogs have something that we can find that is a little bit that they might be struggling with, and probably not hip dysplasia, but
well, for some dogs that grow up really fast, like the large breeds that they go through these growth spurts. Mm-hmm. When you have a little Chihuahua, the little Chihuahua is going to be fully grown a lot quicker than your Great Dane is going to be fully grown, right? As they grow physically, they are building their map, their body map in their brain. It gets, of course, we have that at birth, but it gets more and more refined, so to speak, and connected with different areas of the brain and different sensory zones of the brain as well, and different sensory information gets all integrated. So it becomes more and more complex, this body map. And the Chihuahua is done with building that body map in a few months. Now the Great Dane keeps on changing that, or has to keep on changing that body map for, wow, the first 2 years, 3 years
At
before it's
least. Yeah.
really grown into his full adult body. So that means that during that time, he can develop certain preferences. Say suddenly his bum is standing out like this, and that growth has happened really fast. And this neural change is taking more time to actually rebuild the neural map and understand how his body is positioned now and what form it has taken now after this growth spurt. So that makes it constantly a bit more difficult and a bit more challenging to keep that body map, and thus to constantly have the right type of coordination for this constantly changing body. So
That
it's
makes so much sense.
more of a challenge. And that's where we can see that things can go wrong, in the sense that they can develop preferences of, well, these hind legs, like they've suddenly grown so much, I don't know what to do with them, so I'm going to focus on my front legs and work more with that. Okay, and then we just need, okay, so the sensory information from this part of your body is not making any sense to you. Okay, buddy, I'll help you. Let's get you through some exercises that make it very simple for you, that you can concentrate on this part of your body, that you can actually consciously perceive that type of information. You can place it in your map. You can build your reference map. Now we can do something. Now we can change how you coordinate your full body.
Right. It makes me think actually any injury can change that, can alter the body map as well. So probably throughout life, these sensory maps are don't stay the same.
Well, the sensory maps might stay the same, or they might not change that much unless you have some surgery which changes your receptors. When you have a hip replacement as a human, well, they cut away your joint capsule, so that is never going to give you the exact information anymore, because it's going to be gone. So it can't give you information anymore. That has an influence on how you move and how you can move. And you have to sort of reshape your reference frame of, okay, I don't have that bit of information anymore, so I need to up value this and this and this part of information to still get a full and correct picture. Yeah. But what is so typical for humans when we get a hip replacement, that usually that doesn't, quite often, and still, unless there is a fracture, but if it comes from osteoarthritis, this usually goes on over a few years, and you develop a limp. Now, this limp is a specific type of coordination. It's a neuromotor pattern of movement, which is now ingrained in your brain. This is how we move. And to change that after surgery, that is not always very easy to do. Some people after surgery, they don't have the pain anymore, but they still have the same limp, because now they have to reshape their brain and make a new neuromotor pattern. How do we do that? How do we build neuromotor patterns? Just like anything else in behavior, we need the right type of information, and we need to focus on that, the correct type of information. We need our filter to work correctly so that the right type of information gets perceived and is used to build a new pattern of movement.
A lot of awareness again.
And again, it all comes down to sensory information.
Yeah. Ooh, we went all over today. I loved it.
Maybe a bit complicated too. I guess it could be complicated too if these things are all new.
Yes.
And then me saying that it makes it all much more simpler to look at behavior. But honestly, it does. It honestly does, because it's so basic that the sensory stimulus itself, it's such a basic little thing, little stimulus. And that for everybody is easy to perceive. If it's just a bit of training to focus on it, to focus on observing from that perspective. And then it's easier to understand all this theory behind it. We actually should start with how we observe.
So maybe we can invite our listeners to, when they are observing their dog, to also try to pay attention. What is the dog paying attention to? What kind of sensory information might they be paying attention to? And it's probably many multi channels. So that's a good start. And I might add into our notes here something about the body maps if somebody wants to learn a little more about that, because that might be a new concept and we didn't really go far into explaining that. And if there's any other questions from listeners, we'll answer next time or in our comment section. So always an open invitation to that.
Exactly. Ask away, and then we can talk about it next time.
So for next time, I would like to hear your thoughts and your application of the polyvagal theory. So maybe you can take us on a journey through how you started using that and how is it helping you and helping dogs and their people.
Yeah, it's an important one.
Thank you so much, Els.
Thank you again, and see you next time.
Until next time.